Elmendorf was on Capitol Hill testifying about the 10-year budget outlook and the economy. He was asked about the health care law and extending the debt ceiling, which the House agreed to on Tuesday. This Senate Budget Committee hearing is an hour 45 minutes.
This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone and thank my ranking member, Senator Sessions, and all of our colleagues who are joining us here today. And I want to thank Dr. Doug Elmendorf and the entire staff at the Congressional Budget Office. We really do appreciate all the hard work and high standard of professionalism and objectivity that CBO provides to this committee and to Congress. Those qualities were especially helpful last year in assisting Chairman Ryan and I with the completion of the two-year Bipartisan Budget Act. That deal that we reached in December was a strong step away from the constant crises that we have seen for the past few years. Democrats and Republicans finally came together to pass a budget and roll back the irresponsible cuts from sequestration with a balanced approach that included smarter savings and new revenue. And we came together and compromised to show people everywhere that bipartisan work in Washington is possible. Unfortunately, the drama and uncertainty around the debt limit that caused so much harm to families and the economy last year has come back over the past few weeks, but there was encouraging news this morning. House Republicans seem to have finally realized Democrats are not going to pay a ransom to allow the federal government to pay its bills, and I look forward to them sending over a debt limit bill with no ransom demands attached. And I'm hopeful that we can truly step away from the constant crises and debt limit brinksmanship to build on the bipartisan progress that we did make in our budget deal. Now, recognizing the findings and the challenges that the CBO budget outlook identified, I think we should move forward in two ways. First, we need to work to ensure every family has the opportunity to succeed in America. At the same time, we need to address our long-term fiscal challenges fairly and responsibly. Those two goals go hand in hand because the best way to tackle our long-term fiscal challenges is to invest in broad-based and long-term economic growth. Before we get into the details of the CBO's outlook for the next decade, it's helpful to take a step back and see where we've been. When President Obama took office, we were facing the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The country was losing more than 700,000 jobs a month. Families were losing their homes, and parents were losing confidence in what the future would be like for their children. We have made significant progress since then. We've had 47 consecutive months of private sector job gains. Economists believe economic growth is poised to accelerate this year. The housing market has improved, though we can't forget that a lot of families are still struggling. And of course, even though these are good signs, the recovery hasn't been nearly as fast or as strong as any of us would like. Last Friday's disappointing jobs report is just the latest reminder of that. So while we are moving in the right direction, Congress can and must do more to boost this economic recovery. In the past few years, we've also made significant strides in tackling our fiscal challenges. Since 2009, we have cut our deficit in half. CBO projects it is on a path to decline further this year and the next, with the debt stabilized as a share of the economy through the end of this decade. But as with the economic recovery, we have more work to do. And I look forward to hearing from Dr. Elmendorf about the long-term deficit challenges we cannot ignore. To be clear, discretionary spending, by which I mean investments in priorities like national security and infrastructure and research and education and programs that fight poverty and provide economic security, that's not driving our fiscal challenges. In fact, CBO projects that discretionary spending will continue to decline as a share of GDP through 2024. In the 1970s and 80s, discretionary spending averaged about 10% of GDP. Last year, it was at 7.2% of GDP, and by 2024, those investments will represent just 5.2% of GDP. This decline is alarming because limiting discretionary spending means limiting investments in innovation and cutting-edge technology that actually sparks job growth. It also means threatening our efforts to care for our service members, veterans, and their families. Those lifetime investments will be critical over the next few years as more military families transition from the battlefront to the home front. And limiting discretionary spending will roll back efforts to give kids and families the education and job training opportunities that they need to succeed in a global economy. I want to be clear on another point in the CBO report that caused a lot of confusion last week. For too long in this country, leaving a job also meant leaving behind your health care coverage. In 2008, Harvard University conducted a study that found 11 million workers wanted to change jobs but felt locked into their current jobs simply to keep their insurance. One of those workers is named Christine Lang. She's from my home state of Washington, and a year ago, Christine dreamed of quitting her job to start a small business. But her family relied on her health insurance that she received through her employer. The Affordable Care Act has changed that for her. In January, she retired from her old job and now plans to launch her own business later this year. So by expanding access to health care, more people will also have the opportunity to retire early. More entrepreneurs will have the chance to start a new business without giving up access to health care. And CBO's report makes it clear that the Affordable Care Act is good for parents. That's because it will give more parents the choice to stay home and raise a family, and the choice to reduce hours to take care of an aging parent or a family member. That does not mean that unemployment will go up. In fact, CBO found that on balance, the Affordable Care Act will actually boost demand for goods and services over the next few years. And that's because when people have access to affordable health care, they are able to spend more of their earnings on other family needs. But the latest outlook makes clear we have some areas to work on. The CBO projects mandatory spending for programs like Medicare and Medicaid will continue to rise over the next decade. The solution isn't to shift those growing costs onto seniors and families, as we've heard Republicans propose. We need to work on ways to bring those costs down responsibly. The good news is health care costs have slowed significantly in recent years. From 2010 to 2012, the cost of health care grew at its slowest pace since the government started tracking it in the 1960s, according to the Council of Economic Advisors. The CBO reports the cost of Medicare, quote, will be slower than usual for some years to come. So we need to follow through on the reforms in the Affordable Care Act that reduce costs and increase access to quality care, and we need to work together to build on them. Bringing down health care costs is just one part of the solution. We also need a balanced approach to tackle our deficit, one that reduces spending and raises new revenue fairly and responsibly. As CBO reports, in 2014, federal spending through the tax code is the single largest item in the budget, costing American taxpayers more than Social Security, Medicare, or defense. While some of those tax breaks go to important investments in the middle class and low-income working families, the Treasury loses hundreds of billions of dollars to tax loopholes and carve-outs that benefit the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. Big businesses shouldn't get to write off expenses associated with shutting down a plant in the U.S. and moving it overseas. It's wrong that corporations can claim massive tax breaks by deducting the interest on loans used to finance foreign operations before they pay tax on their foreign income. These unfair tax giveaways only incentivize corporations to move jobs abroad, and they make it harder for U.S. businesses without foreign operations to compete. The list of egregious loopholes and special interest giveaways goes on, and it would be unfair and unacceptable to protect every last one of them and ask seniors and families to bear the burden of deficit reduction alone. In recent years, many in Congress have had almost a singular focus on reducing the budget deficit. While important, that has left us with deeper deficits in other areas. Our roads and bridges are crumbling. We aren't making the investments we need in education and job training. While other nations are investing in innovation and research and development, we've scaled them back. We have a serious jobs deficit and a serious opportunity deficit, and we would be doing families today and the next generation a great disservice if we let those deficits continue to grow. Addressing these deficits isn't just the right thing to do, it's good economics and it's good for the budget. When we invest in job creation and innovation, small business owners create new products and technology the rest of the world wants to buy. And with more growth, more people can find jobs, and incomes increase. As broad-based prosperity increases, our long-term budget challenges become easier to tackle. That point, that these two challenges go hand in hand, is riveted by the latest CBO report. As I read it, Dr. Elmendorf, the biggest change in the deficit and debt projections relative to last May result from changes in CBO's economic projections. Those changes lower revenues and on net increase deficits and debt by $1.2 trillion. To put that in perspective, $1.2 trillion is twice the amount of revenue that Congress elected to raise by allowing a portion of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief to expire for upper-income taxpayers at the end of last Congress. So we need to put in place a credible plan that reduces spending responsibly, that raises revenue by closing wasteful and egregious tax loopholes, and invests in and grows our economy today and pays dividends for generations to come. But to do that, we will have to build on the bipartisan foundation we built with our two-year budget deal. That deal was a good start. It showed that Republicans and Democrats can come together to put families and the economy first. I hope we continue that work and tackle our long-term fiscal challenges fairly and responsibly and expand opportunities for our workers and our families. Because I think if we do that, we can move forward together and build a future of shared prosperity for generations to come. With that, Dr. Elmendorf, I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks, but first we'll hear from my colleague, Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome Director Elmendorf. We want to thank you and your team for the good work and support you give to Congress. The Ryan-Murray bill did, Madam Chairman, create some stability in our fiscal situation, which is good, but it did spend more money than was agreed to in the Budget Control Act. And this very day, we'll be voting again to bust the limits you placed in Ryan-Murray. So this Congress is not showing in any real sense a commitment to honor the promises we make to the American people, and that's one of the reasons our debts have reached such a high level. CBO's latest budget and economic outlook is another sobering report of a number of sobering reports since the 2007 to 2009 recession. It's been 4 years since that recession, long past the time we normally see a more robust growth that we're now recognizing. And the CBO report indicates that in the 10th year, the amount of interest we would pay on our debt just that year is higher than you projected last year after 10 years. It's not a good path. So the nation's policies after the recession ended in 2009 have not come close to producing the results, the growth the President promised. CBO and many other organizations, the President's own OMB and the Federal Reserve, have also made forecasts for economic growth that were far above what actually happened. CBO's report today is a recognition that the economy has failed to lift off after the recession has been declared over. Millions of Americans are hurting. This is not a healthy recovery. It's just not. The United States economy typically reverts to the mean after a recession, but this time it has not. The President has said his stimulus bill, increase in the Affordable Care Act, increased taxes and regulations, and more government spending would result in a strong bounce back. But after President Obama signed the stimulus bill, and the Congressional Budget Office estimated that real GDP growth would be at 4.7% for each of the past 2 years. That's 2012 and 2013. We did not have that growth. It grew at a paltry 1.9% last year, falling from an anemic 2.8% the year before. Only 2 years ago, after the Affordable Care Act was passed, CBO expected real growth this year, 2014, to be 4.6%. Wouldn't we like to have that? After these misses, CBO is now predicting we'd have only 2.7% growth this year. Ominously, the percentage of people participating in the economy, working or looking for work, the labor force participation rate has fallen to 1970s levels. So the policies that the nation has pursued to promote economic growth, they have not had the effect we hoped for. The growth that is needed to increase the number of Americans with jobs did not occur. The recovery to date has seen corporate profits increase some, and the wealthy to see their investments grow at least close to what they were before the recession. But working Americans have seen lower wages, more part-time jobs, and fewer full-time jobs. It's clear that growth at 2% is merely treading water. It must be sharply higher to increase the number of Americans actually working. Certainly, we've learned in this recovery that GDP growth without real benefits can occur without real benefits for the working people in our country. And sadly, CBO's report also recognizes that the President's 2010 health care law is a hammer blow to lower-income workers. Despite concerns raised at the time that the Affordable Care Act would reduce work opportunities, CBO did not think that effect would be significant when the law was signed into law in 2010. CBO now estimates Obamacare will lead to Americans working fewer hours or dropping out, and this will be the equivalent of 2.5 million productive Americans. In other words, 4 years after the health care law was enacted, and just as it is beginning to be implemented, CBO has now tripled its estimate of the number of jobs that will be lost, or equivalent jobs that will be lost as a result of the law. So that means the average employed person's wages will total $930 less over 10 years. CBO has been criticized for this finding, but the analysis you've made, Dr. Elmendorf, it seems to me just reflects what data is showing. Indeed, 2/3 of jobs created in 2013 were part-time jobs. So I look forward to receiving from CBO more information about how these conclusions were derived. We do know this compensation loss will fall more heavily on lower-income Americans. So this is another example of the policies with good intentions that are actually hurting working Americans, not helping them. The end result is that CBO has reduced its estimate of the economy's growth potential, and the report finds the U.S. economy is not assumed to reach even that reduced potential over the next 10 years under current policies. So let's pause a minute to consider an important point. As stated by the Free Market-Oriented National Review, they declare rightly, I think, that we are a nation with an economy, not an economy with a nation. It is our duty to take principled, achievable steps that will benefit the most of Americans in our country, not just the fortunate few, and to do so without increasing our debt, which is already well into the danger zone. So I hope the CBO's report and today's discussion can help serve as a springboard for a more serious conversation about what's going on in the U.S. economy and the people who have not prospered. Spend, borrow, regulate, and tax have not worked as a jump start to prosperity. Expanding government has not produced prosperity. Stimulus programs and quantitative easing have done little good. Indeed, these actions, reality shows, overall have produced far weaker growth than was predicted even just a few years ago, and which we normally see after a recession. So working Americans should focus less on promises and good intentions. They need to focus more on results and what will actually happen. That's what we in Congress should do. Good intentions are not sufficient. We need to enact sound policies that reduce the deficits and put us on a path to growth and prosperity. I thank you for your report, Dr. Elmendorf, and look forward to working with you as we go forward.
Thank you. Dr. Elmendorf, I understand that your microphone is not working, so we've jury-rigged something for you. It's probably unfortunate that our microphones didn't blow out, but be as it is, I hope that that one works well for you and we can move forward with your testimony.
So I hope this will be fine. Thank you, Chairman Murray, Senator Sessions, and members of the committee. On behalf of all of my colleagues who worked so hard to produce these reports on the outlook for the budget and the economy and on the slow recovery of our labor market, I'm happy to be here today Beginning with the budget, the federal budget deficit has fallen sharply during the past few years, and it is on a path to decline further this year and next year. We estimate that under current law, the budget deficit this year will total about $500 billion, compared with $1.4 trillion in 2009. At that level, this year's deficit would equal about 3% of the nation's economic output, or GDP, close to the average percentage seen during the past 40 years. As you know, our baseline projections show what we think would happen to federal spending, revenues, and deficits over the next 10 years if current laws generally were unchanged. Under that assumption, the deficit is projected to decrease again in 2015 to about 2.5% of GDP. After that, however, deficits are projected to start rising, both in dollar terms and as a share of the economy, because revenues are expected to grow at roughly the same pace as GDP, whereas spending is expected to grow more rapidly than GDP. Why the more rapid spending growth? In our baseline, spending is boosted by 4 factors: the aging of the population, the expansion of federal subsidies for health insurance, rising health care costs per beneficiary, and mounting interest payments on federal debt. With no changes in the applicable laws, spending for Social Security will increase from about 5% of GDP this year to about 5.5% in 2024. Spending for the major health care programs, a category that includes Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, and subsidies to be provided through insurance exchanges, will climb from less than 5% this year to more than 6% in 2024 under current laws. And net interest payments by the federal government are also projected to grow rapidly, primarily because interest rates are likely to return to more typical levels. In sharp contrast, the rest of the federal government's non-interest spending for defense, for benefit programs other than the ones I just mentioned, and for all other non-defense activities, is projected to drop from about 9.5% of GDP this year to about 7.5% in 2024 under current law. That would be the lowest percentage of GDP since at least 1940, which is the earliest year for which comparable data have been reported. Thus, an increasing share of the budget would go toward benefits from a few large programs, and a shrinking share would go toward most of the rest of the government's functions. The large budget deficits recorded in recent years have substantially increased federal debt, and the amount of debt relative to the size of the economy is now very high by historical standards. We estimate that federal debt held by the public will equal 74% of GDP at the end of this year, and under current law will reach 79% in 2024. Such large and growing federal debt could have serious negative consequences, including restraining economic growth in the long term, giving policymakers less flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges, and eventually increasing the risk of a fiscal crisis, in which investors would demand high interest rates to buy the government's debt. Turning to the economy, we expect that after a frustratingly slow recovery from the severe recession of 2007 to 2009, the economy will grow at a solid pace for the next few years, but will continue to have considerable unused labor and capital resources, or slack. Further growth in housing construction and business investment should raise output and employment, and the resulting increase in income should boost consumer spending. In addition, under current law, the federal government's tax and spending policies will not restrain economic growth this year to the extent they did last year. And state and local governments are likely to increase their purchases of goods and services, adjusted for inflation, after having reduced them for several years. As a result, our baseline shows inflation-adjusted GDP expanding more quickly from 2014 to 2017 at an average rate of roughly 3% a year than it did in 2013. We expect that those increases in output will spur businesses to hire more workers, pushing down the unemployment rate and tending to raise the rate of participation in the labor force, as some discouraged workers return to the labor force in search of jobs. That effect on participation will keep the unemployment rate from falling as much as it would otherwise. We project that the unemployment rate will decline only gradually over the next few years, finally dropping below 6% in 2017 and then edging down further after that. Nevertheless, the labor force participation rate is also projected to decline further in the next few years because, according to our analysis, the increase in participation stemming from improvements in the economy will be more than offset by downward pressure from demographic trends, especially the aging of the baby boom generation. After 2017, when the demographic trends will still be unfolding, but the effects of cyclical conditions will, we expect, have largely waned, the participation rate is projected to decline more rapidly. That is the main reason why, beyond 2017, we project that economic growth will diminish to only a bit more than 2% per year, a pace that is well below the average seen over the past several decades. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Elmendorf, let me start off by asking you a question about the role the overall economy plays in our efforts to address the deficit. Last week's CBO report describes how, quote-unquote, lingering effects from the Great Recession and the subsequent slow recovery continue to dampen our economic potential. Relatedly, your report contains some very significant downward revisions to your expectations about the strength of our economy over the next decade, and the direct fiscal consequences of those revisions were pretty dramatic, about $1.2 trillion in added debt by 2024. That added debt is not from new spending programs or new tax cuts. It's purely because CBO now expects the economy to be weaker than it's previously thought, correct?
Yes, that's right, Senator.
Okay, so my question is about the importance of economic growth and building a strong economy and tackling our deficits and our debt. Certainly, we've got to continue to work to reform spending programs in the tax code. But do you believe, given the large negative impact your economic revisions had on the budget projections, that fiscal responsibility also requires that we take measures that ensure we have a strong economy?
Yes, Senator. Any actions that the Congress can take to boost economic growth can have a very powerful effect on the future budget outlook. There are no plausible changes in economic growth that would make the long-term budget pressures go away. When we did our long-term budget outlook last fall, we looked at a range of alternative possible growth rates of the economy and interest rates and healthcare costs and so on. And the fundamental problem will remain. But the magnitude of the problem, the extent of the changes that would be needed in tax policy or spending policy or both would be smaller if the economy were to grow more rapidly.
Okay. Last week, a rippling effect of the CBO report was the wide confusion about the section dealing with the impact of the Affordable Care Act on the workforce. That confusion actually was bad enough that the Washington Post fact checker examined some of the claims just a few days ago. Don't know if you all saw it, but he called them, quote unquote, out of context, deliberately misleading, and gave them 3 Pinocchios. Now, as Chairman Ryan noted in the hearing last week when you were before them, your report doesn't say that the Affordable Care Act is causing employers to lay off workers. In fact, the ACA is making it possible for people to be innovative and start new companies without being locked into a job or keeping longer hours just so they can have health insurance. So can you please clarify this part of your outlook and specifically tell us, are you saying that the ACA will cause 2.5 million people to lose their jobs, as some are claiming you said?
No, Senator. We would not characterize our results as saying that 2 or 2.5 million people would lose their jobs. I have not, to be honest, read all of the coverage that sprouted last week, but we took pains in a blog posting yesterday to emphasize the point we made in the appendix to the Outlook last week, that almost the entire effect that we're projecting comes not from people losing their jobs, but from people choosing to work not at all or to work shorter hours.
Stay home and take care of their kids, start a new business, other things that families have that kind of choice.
A range of other activities, Senator, yes.
Can you talk a bit about how increased accessibility and affordability and availability of health insurance helps workers and specifically prevents what is known as job lock?
Yes, Senator. So the subsidized health insurance coverage that will be provided under the Affordable Care Act through both the expansion of Medicaid and through the initiation of tax credits to be provided for insurance bought through insurance exchanges, those subsidies make the people who receive them better off by raising their by providing health insurance coverage at reduced cost to them. Some of them will respond to being better off by not working or working less. In addition, and this is intrinsic to some extent, in any program that provides benefits to lower-income people, those benefits are withdrawn under the Affordable Care Act as people's income rises. Lower-income people receive them and higher-income people do not. And that withdrawal of benefits creates an implicit tax that also reduces the incentive to work to some extent. As you noted, the health insurance system as it existed prior to the Affordable Care Act also distorted people's labor market behavior relative to some ideal system in which health insurance was not related to work. And in particular, there's been a substantial amount of research showing that people who had jobs and had particular health problems or concerns about the risk of health problems would then be unwilling to leave those jobs to take other jobs they might be more productive in if they thought they would lose their health insurance. That's the phenomenon known as job lock, and that is a phenomenon that is under the Affordable Care Act wouldn't be there because people would be able to obtain health insurance through exchanges and possibly obtain subsidies for health insurance coverage.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your clarification. Senator Sessions?
Thank you. I think I understand, Mr. Elmendorf, your comments about the Affordable Care Act and hours lost and reduced. I would note that from my perspective that what you've indicated is the Act has a tendency to incentivize people not to work. And what we need in this country, in my opinion, is incentives to work, and that will help us be more productive. And we've got to create systems, I think, to help people work even longer and reduce the amount they're drawing down their retirement benefits, extending and increasing their Social Security benefits if they can work longer, and we should be looking to do that.
As you know, Senator, we've done analysis of the effects on the federal budget and on the economy of raising the eligibility age for some programs to encourage people to work longer, as you were suggesting.
I think we've got to talk about that. And you note that the big programs are the ones that are drawing a larger percentage of the taxpayers' revenue each year, are leading us and accelerating our debt course. I would just have to say, colleagues, that we're not going to be able to fix that and address it effectively if the President of the United States will not look the American people in the eye and tell them we have a problem that needs to be fixed. I wish it were different, but he has not done that, and we're not going to be able to achieve progress unless he does. Just looking at your estimate of interest cost that we'll be paying each year is rather stunning. Do you recall what the interest payment total was last year? About, was it $240 or $250? That we actually paid out of our Treasury to...
Yes, so last year there were $221 billion in net interest, Senator.
So you project, and last year, last May, you projected it the 10-year end, 10 years from now, we would be paying $823 billion. This year, you project 10 years from today, we'll be paying $880 billion in 1 year, each of those 1 year in interest on the debt, which is over $500 billion more than we're now paying each year on the debt. And where does this money come from? That's the question I think the American people need to ask. It's going to come out of programs that people from both parties believe in, want to support, and want to see grow, and they're not going to be able to grow because we're going to have this huge increase in interest, the largest, fastest increasing part of our budget. Would you not agree, fundamentally?
Yes, Senator, that's right.
Now, you projected that a couple of years ago, I believe, that if interest rates increased 1%, that would add a $1 trillion extra interest cost to the budget. This year, I believe you're saying that if interest rates increase 1%, it would add $1.5 trillion to the cost of to our budget cost. Is that correct? Yes,
Senator. If interest rates were 1 percentage point higher throughout the coming decade, we estimate that would add about $1.5 trillion to the federal deficit.
And I teased you a little bit about missing some of your growth projections, but nobody knows for sure what interest rates will be 4, 5, 6, 8 years from now, do they? You just make the best estimates you can.
That's right, Senator. And your critique of our past economic forecast was quite correct. We missed the extent to which this recovery would be very slow. We had built in a slow recovery by the standards of the post-war U.S. period, but not slow enough. And I think the people who had looked more carefully at financial crises in other countries over longer periods of time and said, no, this kind of crisis takes a long time to recover from, were more right than we were.
Just briefly, since we can't, in my opinion, continue to borrow more, to spend more, to stimulate the economy, if we had a slower, a simpler tax code with a lower top marginal rate for corporate tax rate, as witnesses have said, would that help growth, be positive for growth?
Yes, Senator, and a tax reform that broadened the base and brought down rates on either the corporate or individual sides or both would be positive for economic growth. How much difference it would make would depend on the specific.
If we could identify regulations that were unnecessary and eliminate those, would that allow more growth to occur?
It might, Senator, but again, the effects would depend very much on the
experts tell us that regulations are adversely impacting growth. I would think so. If we produce more American energy and imported less, would that help growth in America?
Yes, Senator, I think it would, and we're in the process of working on an analysis now of the effects of fracking on the U.S. economy and on the budget, and we hope to.
If we could reform our 80 or so means-tested social programs and to focus more on incentivizing and training people to work and to move out into the employment field, would that improve America's GDP growth?
Yes, I think it would, Senator. Again, the effects would depend very much on the specific changes.
And if we had a leaner, more productive government, just the money that came into this United States government, and we got more for it for our citizens, would that be good for growth?
Well, getting more effective government services or more benefits per dollar tax revenue would be good for people by receiving more benefits or services. And if for growth depends on a lot of the timing of the changes and the nature of the changes.
And if we brought our deficits under control, would that create more confidence and more growth in the future?
Reduction in the long-term projected deficits would be good for the economy in the long term, and we think in terms of people's confidence today, Senator. Thank you.
Senator Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You know, listening to the debate always on the budget and the numbers, I think for people watching this today, scratch their heads because you can look at things so many different ways. I want to back up and just start with some good news. And if, in fact, bringing down the deficit increases economic activity, we ought to all be celebrating today. Mr. Elmendorf, when you say that in 2009 we had a $1.4 trillion deficit, this year it will be $500 billion. Did I hear you say that?
Yes, that's right, Senator.
Yes. So that's a pretty big drop. Pretty big drop.
Senator.
And we should actually view that as good news. And in fact, it is good news. May not be good politically for folks that want to use the issue, but it's good news. We also have seen 8.5 million private sector jobs. We need more, but certainly in the last few years, and that's a good thing. Do you stand by your statement that says in your report, in CBO's judgment, there is no compelling evidence that part-time employment has increased as a result of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, we stand by that, Senator.
Yes, thank you. So, in fact, what we are seeing is job growth, and what we need is more of it. One of the things that is concerning to me in your numbers is, for us as policymakers, is that you've indicated that in discretionary spending, our investments in education, opportunity, rebuilding America, infrastructure, innovation, those things that we do to compete in a global economy, that in the next 10 years we'll see the lowest investments in those things that affect people and opportunity, economic development, since 1940. Did I hear you correctly?
So the specific fact, Senator, was that all of federal spending, apart from Social Security, the health care programs, and interest on the debt, so the rest includes defense spending, non-defense discretionary spending, and the other benefit programs and mandatory spending. that collection of programs together, spending will be smaller as a share of the economy in 2024 under current law than at any point since at least 1940.
So when we're looking at a global economy competing with China, with those around the world investing like crazy to lower their costs of college, to build their countries, to invest in clean energy and so on, we in America are actually going in the opposite direction. And I want to underscore that when you've talked about economic growth mitigating some of the other factors, obviously we care about long-term deficit. Obviously we want to continue to stay on a path of fiscal responsibility. But certainly growing would do an awful lot, creating jobs would do an awful lot to mitigate that. My questions, I want to go back just one more time because I feel like we're speaking two languages here on the committee as it relates to the Affordable Care Act. So I want to go back just one more time and ask you, as it relates to the ability for people to have freedom to dream big dreams and make decisions without being chained to their desk or their job. One more time. Did the February 2014 report on the budget and economic outlook find that the Affordable Health Care Law will end 2.5 million jobs?
What we found, Senator, was that about 2.5 million, that we found that people would reduce their work effort by the equivalent of about 2.5 million full-time equivalent positions.
Okay, but is that 2.5 million jobs that we would lose? We
said that we did not say that 2.5 million people would lose their jobs.
Or that we would lose 2.5 million jobs in the economy.
We have not quantified the ultimate effect on employment. I want to be careful here, as you say, Senator. We think that when people talk about people outside of economic and budget people, talk about people losing their jobs, they mean people who are laid off from jobs they want to keep. What we describe in our report is almost entirely people who are choosing to work less or not to work because of the extra benefits they will receive under the Affordable Care Act and the withdrawal of those benefits as incomes rise. That is a reduction in the supply of labor that is driving the change, and the amount of the change is ultimately a reduction an equivalent of 2.5 million full-time equivalent positions.
So we're giving people more choices, just like those who are very wealthy and live off investments can choose whether or not to be actively in the workplace or not, or to do other things, philanthropic things, or to spend time with their family. We're giving a choice to someone in my family, in fact, right now where this is very real, who wants to stay home with their 18-month-old and has not been able to do that because her family's health care comes from her job as opposed to her husband who's in small business. And so they're going to have a different kind of freedom to be able to do something, I would argue, that is just as productive, which is to raise a little boy and have mom at home.
So, Senators, as we were clear yesterday, we're not judging the
I appreciate that.
The things they're choosing
I
to do.
appreciate that. Yeah, no, I'm actually evaluating and judging.
The economics of the situation.
Yes, what I'm doing is adding the evaluation, which is moms or dads being able to be home with little ones has tremendous value for their family and for all of us. And I'm so proud that we're going to be able to give moms and dads that choice. And then, Madam Chair, I know my time is out, but on the other end, also in my family, are individuals that are going to be able to retire from some very, very hard work a little bit early, and in one case, develop a small business they've been hoping to for a long, long time. So I think the freedom involved in folks being able to make choices is one of the wonderful things about moving forward and not having health care have to be tied to employment.
Okay,
thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Grassley.
Yeah. I want to continue that discussion, but I want to look at the macroeconomic impact rather than the specific number of jobs or what's related to what people can do or not do. I'd like to ask you about the lackluster economic recovery in the labor market. We already know that the labor force participation rate is at the lowest point since 1975, although I guess last month it ticked up just a hair. CBO now projects that the Affordable Care Act would reduce the number of full-time equivalent workers by about 2 million by 2017, 2.5 million by 2024. obviously a result of some people choosing to not work at all or others choosing to work less. The fact is, it is a disincentive for some people to work, resulting in a decrease of labor supply. So, yes, getting to the questions, to grow the economy and increase economic opportunities, we need more workers and ought to encourage people to work. What effect will this have on the economy and GDP growth?
So, Senator, the reduction in the supply of labor that we estimate would result from the Affordable Care Act pulls down GDP, pulls down investment, pulls down tax revenues relative to what would be the case otherwise.
So simply put, it is not in our economic interest to shrink the size of the workforce.
Well, it's not in the interest of GDP to reduce the workforce. Of course, how we value GDP,
well, GDP is
again, not our place.
More for more people, and if we're going to have lower GDP, we're going to have more people in this country, and more people are going to have less. If you got to expand the economic pie, if more people are going to have more. It seems like, to me, like it's very basic to Americans to have a more for more people. So finally, then, would it be fair to say that discouraging people to work is harmful to our economic growth and diminishes an individual's economic opportunity?
It is harmful to our economic growth, Senator. I don't want to speak to how an individual feels about this because there are pros and cons, but it does reduce our economic growth, absolutely.
Thank you. According to CBO, federal revenues are expected to reach $3 trillion this year, or 17.5% of the economy, which is just a little bit below a 40-year average. Over the 10-year window, revenues are expected to grow at the same pace as the economy and average about 18.1% of GDP. Conversely, federal spending for 2014 will be 20.5% of GDP, which matches about a 40-year average. CBO projects the outlays will grow faster than the economy over the next decade and will equal 22.5% of GDP by 2024. What is the economic impact of spending that consistently outpaces revenue? And secondly, doesn't this demonstrate that we have a spending problem that's fiscally unsustainable?
Yes, Senator, we think the federal budget is on an unsustainable path. As you understand, when spending outpaces revenues for prolonged periods of time, especially after we get out of this current economic downturn, then those deficits lead to an accumulation of federal debt. That debt crowds out some private capital investment, which reduces GDP and wages and incomes relative to what they otherwise would be. In addition, as I noted, the rising debt reduces your and your colleagues' flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges that arise and raises the risk of a fiscal crisis down the road.
Since CBO's previous baseline budget projection of May 2013, you've raised the estimate of the cumulative deficit between 2014 and 2023 by $1 trillion. According to CBO, most of the increase in projected deficits result from lower economic growth and thus lower tax revenue. First question, can you describe what economic factors have led to the lower economic growth projections? And secondly, can you describe what the impact the federal debt at 79% of the economy will have on economic growth?
So, Senator, the second question first, the high amount of debt, historically high amount of debt that we project throughout the coming decade will diminish economic growth by the end of the decade by crowding out some capital investment and reducing our ability to produce. The downward revision to our projection of GDP actually stems from a large collection of factors, no one of which was dominant, but almost all of which ended up going in the same direction. And we looked at revised data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the comprehensive revision to national income accounts last year. We reassessed how close we thought actual output would get to potential output by the second half of the decade. Historically, in fact, there's been some shortfall there, and we built that into our projection this time. We took a new look at the effects of the Affordable Care Act on the labor force, as we've been discussing, and there are a number of other factors as well. And the collection of those factors brings down, by our estimate, real GDP, inflation-adjusted GDP, by 2% at the end of the 10 years, relative to what we thought before. We've also brought down the price level so that nominal GDP in our projection is 3.5% below what it was before. And that's the dominant factor in our upward revision to projected deficits.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Elmendorf.
Senator?
We are having an ongoing discussion in the Senate about extending unemployment insurance. In Rhode Island, I, just flying down, sat next to a lady who has a friend who sort of meets the profile that we're talking about. She has worked all her life, and she was not able to retire, and she lost her job, and she's in her 50s, and it's very hard for her to find employment. It's through no fault of her own whatsoever. She's constantly looking for work. In Rhode Island, we still have a 9% unemployment rate, and if you put the number of people looking for work against the number of jobs, there's just no way you can make it fit. So, and we're also hearing that if you extend unemployment insurance, that will have an unhelpful effect on our employment numbers, because really these are lazy people who are out there goofing off, and if they just got a good solid swat from having their unemployment insurance benefits cut off, then they'd get back to work.
That is not what our analysis shows, Senator.
Indeed, your analysis seems to show the exact contrary. Could you tell us what your analysis shows of what the effect of extending unemployment insurance benefits would be on national unemployment levels?
So, Senator, our analysis suggests that if the emergency unemployment benefits were extended through this year, that would raise real GDP by 0.2% at the end of the year, and would increase full-time equivalent employment at the end of the year by about 200,000 positions.
So, put the other way, to reverse what you just said, the Republican insistence on blocking even a paid-for unemployment insurance extension is costing this country a 0.2% GDP growth, and will cost 200,000 jobs if it isn't resolved.
Senator, I can only repeat our analysis. Your attribution of consequences to particular people is beyond the scope of my position.
But it does have that effect. Those are the effects that you've quantified.
The effects that we wrote about in a letter to Congressman Van Hollen in December remain our estimates, and we repeat some of them in the report we released last week.
Well, on the strength of that, I take this opportunity to urge my Republican colleagues who came within one vote of doing this. We're one vote away from adding 0.2% to GDP and 200,000 jobs to the economy by doing the right thing for people who are out of work through no fault of their own. And how we're at a place where that isn't something we can work together to get done, I think, is a sad commentary on politics in Washington. My time is running out, so let me close. I hear my colleagues on the other side talk about the debt and the deficit and say how, this is, to use words that were used today, this is a problem that needs to be fixed. And the enthusiasm and the passion and the militancy with which our colleagues on the other side pursue the debt and the deficit problem, I think, is commendable. What concerns me is that that passion and that militancy and that determination evaporate as soon as you're talking about benefits that go out to wealthy folks and to corporations through the tax code. We are, I think, more than happy to work to reduce our debt and deficit, but it is impossible for me to look at adding to the cuts that we've applied to middle-income families and to investments like infrastructure and scientific exploration and innovation, and at the same time be protecting the right of a hedge fund billionaire to pay a lower tax rate than a brick mason in Rhode Island. And my test of when our colleagues are going to be actually serious about the debt and the deficit is when it's no longer less important than protecting carried interest for hedge fund billionaires. As long as the primary thing is to protect that tax benefit and a horde of others that go to high-end and corporate politically influential people, you can't put those two, to me, side by side and say that we're actually really all that serious about the debt and the deficit. You're only as serious about the debt and deficit as you are putting it in relation to other things, and put in relation to protecting hedge fund billionaires paying lower tax rates than brick masons, to me, puts context into that claim. Thank you.
Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, first let me say, Dr. Elmendorf, thanks for being here. And I just want to compliment you and your team. My staff and I have, on numerous occasions, turned to your office for help when we are wrestling with legislative challenges, whether it's potentially changes to the flood insurance program or granting the administration some flexibility in managing through a difficult sequester. Your staff has consistently and timely been responsive in helping us to understand the budgetary implications, the scoring implications, and that is a very, very helpful service. So you got a great team, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Senator. That means a tremendous amount to all of us.
Well, they do a great job. I do have to say, I am shocked, have been since last week, not by your analysis that suggests that if you increase incentives to leave the workforce, some people will in fact leave the workforce. That's not shocking. That's not revolutionary. What's shocking to me is my colleagues suggesting that this is a great thing, that it's somehow a good thing to diminish the incentives to work. I don't know how we got to the place in America where work has become a terrible thing, that we must unshackle people from the misery of having to be productive and from actually supporting their family. And I don't know how it's lost on so many people in this town that work is a source of dignity, and it is the way people get ahead, and it has always been the source of advancement in our society. I'm not asking you to comment on that. I think you'd probably rather not. But I do want to be clear. Your analysis about the effects that result from the incentives of Obamacare, your analysis says that we will have a smaller workforce as a result.
Yeah,
correct?
Absolutely.
And a smaller workforce means a smaller economy.
Yes, that is our estimate, Senator.
So your analysis is that as a result of this phenomenon, we have less total output, and I think it's very clear that that means less opportunity, less prosperity. One of the things that's really disturbing about your projections is how meager the economic growth forecast is. For most recent decades, I'm not sure exactly what the time frame I have here, actually I guess about the last 60 years or so, even including the Great Recession, average real GDP growth's been over 3%. You are projecting that it, starting from next year forward, it just gradually declines every year, every single year, till we get to about 2%, which is well below our historical average. And what that means is just fewer people working, fewer people getting raises, fewer people advancing, and a lower standard of living. Isn't that what it means to have a 2% GDP growth instead of a 3% GDP growth?
So let me just be clear here that the thing whose growth slows throughout the decade is the growth of potential output. There will be some recovery of actual output up toward potential as we continue the recovery. But then potential output growth, you're right, Senator, we think will be much lower in the future than the past. The most significant part of that is the demographic change. It is the retirement of baby boomers, but there are other factors as well.
Well, there are. And, in fact, you knew very well the demographics of the aging population last year. That hasn't changed in the last year. Demographics are very immutable. But yet you've reduced your forecast for the actual size of our GDP. In fact, you reduced it so much between last year and this year. It's $1 trillion, which is a hard number to, roughly, $1 trillion in 2024. It's a hard number to wrap your brain around, so one way to think about it, that is the total economic output of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland combined. That's how much you have diminished your forecast of economic growth in 2024. So could you share with us the main reasons that you think our economy is going to be so much smaller now than you thought a year ago?
So there are a large collection of factors, Senator. Part of it was that the national income accounts data were revised last summer, and that affected our view of how much output had grown in the past. It affected our view of what productivity growth was likely to be going forward. There were new data that changed our view of how much the labor force had grown in the past. So there are a lot of factors. We also did, as we've discussed, a reevaluation, a very intensive examination of the effects of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
So this collection of things, it turned out that the revisions were largely in one direction, but we do think our current projection is the best one that we can give you at this point in time, recognizing tremendous uncertainty.
But a significant contributing factor is the decline in the total workforce participation rate. Isn't that?
Oh, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
If you look at the most significant factor explaining why growth will be slow in the future relative to the past is slower growth of the labor force.
Yeah.
And that is partly the retirement of baby boomers. It is partly that the big increase in women's participation in the labor force in the 70s and 80s won't be repeated.
Right, but you knew that last year. I'm talking about the difference from this year to last year. I see my time is out, and I appreciate your answers, Dr. Elmendorf. I would just suggest that since the Great Recession, we've been in this great experiment with virtually, and in some ways completely unprecedented governmental policies, massive expansion in regulatory burdens imposed on the economy, huge tax increases, massive surge in spending, which has since declined somewhat, but is projected to grow again, completely unprecedented monetary policy. And I would just suggest that the data that's coming in is indicating this isn't working so well, and the forecast is for it to get worse. I hope we'll get off this path. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Just quickly, by way of introduction, there's a lot of food for thought in this. Senator Toomey's comments about, does the ACA disincentivize work? The way I look at it, federal government's been disincentivizing work for a long time. I mean, it used to be through tax policy. We used to tax investment income at a rate that was less than wage income. I'm sorry, we used to tax investment income at a rate significantly higher than salary and wages. Then they reached a rough equivalence, and now we decide to tax work much heavier than we tax investment income. So if we're going to look at what disincentivizes work, we need to tackle the tax expenditure issue. That's my editorial comment. The questions I want to ask to make sure I understand the report deal with revenue as a percentage of GDP and spending as a percentage of GDP. Dr. Elmendorf, as I read the report, and this is pages 79 and 80, on revenue as a percentage of GDP, the 10-year average you project from 2014 to 2024 is about 18.1%. Varies over the 10 years, but that's the average.
Yes.
The 40-year average, going back essentially to the start of Medicaid and Medicare 40 years, is 17.5%. So the next 10 years we're projecting to be somewhat higher. But in the 5 times when we've had a balanced budget, the average of revenue to GDP is between 19 and 20%. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Senator.
For the record, I would like to ask you to submit an answer to this question later, and that is, if over the next 10 years, instead of an 18.1% revenue to GDP, we had a 19.5%, or whatever the average is of the 5 years when we balanced it, we had a 19.5% revenue to GDP, what would that do to the deficit projections over the next 10 years? And what would it do to the projections of annual interest payments over the next 10 years? Now, I know that it involves some assumptions that you could just up it to 19.5 without having crosswind economic effects, but I just would like to know mathematically, because I believe what we have is not just a spending problem, but a revenue problem. I would like to know mathematically, if we had revenue at 19.5% of GDP, what would that do to deficit projections and interest expense over the 2014 to 24 period?
We'll provide you that answer, Senator. Similarly,
on spending, which is at pages 49 and 50 in your report, you project from 2014 to 2024 that spending will go from 20.8% of GDP to 22.4%, and the components of that are also interesting. Social Security from 4.9 to 5.6, major health programs, Medicare especially, from 4.8 to 6.1, other mandatory programs dropping from 2.5 to 2.2, discretionary programs really dropping from 6.4 to 5.2, interest payments going up as a percentage of GDP from 1.3 to 3.3. For the record, I would like to ask you to calculate where tax expenditures fit in this component. In your section in the CBO report on spending, you don't have tax expenditures. You would consider that more on the revenue side. But based on the work that we've done on this committee and the chairwoman's opening statement that the tax expenditures are virtually larger than any other, programmatic line item, and they are every bit as much, quote, entitlements as other entitlement programs. Unlike the budget that we battle every year to how much to put into Pell Grants, so often these tax expenditures get put into codes and then we just let them go forever. I would be interested over the course of 2014 to 2024 as what is the projection of tax expenditures as a percentage of GDP and how that would change over the 10-year period. I know that involves some assumptions too, assumptions about congressional behavior, will tax expenditures be extended, et cetera. But obviously you built some of that into your revenue projections anyway, and I'd like to see the magnitude of tax expenditures as a percentage of GDP as a follow-up question for the record, if that's okay.
We're happy to do that, Senator. I will say that we have a discussion of tax expenditures in the revenue chapter of the report. We note there that the 12 largest tax expenditures, which are about 3/4 of the total dollars, would total about 6.5% of GDP over the coming decade.
So if the 12 largest, are 6.5% of GDP and they're 3/4, then you're probably talking about a total of like 9 to 9.5% of GDP if you put all the tax expenditures.
I think that's right. I think we've not projected all of them out over the entire decade, which is why we put it that way. There's a widespread consensus among analysts that tax expenditures have the same types of effects on the budget and on the economy as many types of direct federal spending, and thus should be viewed comparably by analysts and by policymakers.
They cost money, but they can also kind of warp market behavior. And well, I would love that answer with all of the tax expenditures added in. But just if I'm doing the math right, if the 12 largest at 6.5% are 3/4 of the total, and so the actual total is closer to 9.5%, I mean, that is significantly larger than Social Security, significantly larger than Medicare and other health programs, and almost double of what the discretionary budget would be over the next year. So I would just ask you to submit that answer for the record.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Start out with, there are a number of things I agreed with you in your opening comments. You said that we really want to drive for opportunity, growth. I think we've pretty well established, I think in the testimony, that the Affordable Care Act is going to decrease economic growth by shrinking our labor force. I also agree that we need to address our long-term fiscal challenge. I disagree with the way you typify certainly what folks like me want to do in terms of a debt ceiling. It's not about demanding a ransom. It's about trying to instill, if we're going to increase the debt burden on our children and grandchildren, I think most Americans would expect us to at least enact some reforms to the long-term entitlement programs, instill some additional fiscal discipline. So let me start out there, Director Elmendorf. If we stop deficit spending today, and I realize that's kind of a long shot, if we stopped deficit spending today, other than maybe some short-term cash flow problems, there would be no reason whatsoever to increase the debt ceiling, correct?
Well, Senator, as you know, the unified budget deficit does not capture all of the forces that lead to an increase in the debt subject to limit.
Okay, there could be some cash flow issues, there can be some working, I got that, but in general, in terms of how dramatically we're having to increase the debt ceiling, by and large, the reason we have to increase the debt ceiling is because we continue to deficit spend, correct?
Yes, that's right, Senator.
Okay, I've got a chart up here because I think as a problem solver myself, the first step in solving a problem is you have to admit you have one. And when I hear people say that Social Security is solvent to the year 2033, I challenge that assumption. And the next step is you have to properly define it. Now, I would continue to argue that we don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We have a 30-year demographic problem. And these are, what we've done with your CBO estimates is, everything you do is basically percentage of GDP, or most of what you do, which certainly I found in contact in talking to my constituents, they don't quite, that doesn't really do it for them in terms of understanding the problem. So what we've attempted to do, and I would certainly like your input, I want to make sure that we're getting this right, but off of the latest CBO projections, we've taken those percentage of GDP, put numbers to them. This is what we come up with over the next 30 years. In other words, a deficit spending of $8 trillion in the first decade, $31 trillion in the second decade, $88 trillion in the third decade, for a whopping total of $127 trillion. And I want to first focus on Social Security because I appreciated during our December Budget Conference Committee hearing when I was just kind of going through the practicality or the reality of the fact that, yes, the Social Security Trust Fund holds right now $2.7 trillion of government bonds, but the Treasury has that offsetting liability, which nets to zero. And your CBO projections of basically deficit spending in the Social Security Trust Fund, in other words, the amount of benefits we're going to pay out that exceed the payroll tax, it's about $15 trillion. Is that largely correct?
We've not done the calculation in dollar terms as you have, Senator, but it certainly would be a large number, and I would defer to your calculation.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, seeing as you're being very cooperative with Senator Kaine in terms of providing those types of calculations, we've been asking, and your staff has been helpful, but I would really like CBO to start converting these percentage GDP. You do provide long-term GDP figures in dollars. I think if we convert all the rest of your alternate scenarios and baselines in dollars, that'd be extremely helpful.
So as you know, Senator, we focus on shares of GDP because we think that nominal dollars have less and less meaning as one goes further and further out. We project that GDP over the coming decade will be more than $200 trillion in aggregate. So I think we find that these sorts of numbers, without the context of the size of the economy around them, have the potential to be
but it's all relative. So you publish the dollar amount of the size of the economy. So in 30 years, the size of the economy, according to your numbers, would be $64.8 trillion. And so off of that percentage GDP, what we're coming up with is the deficits, the cumulative deficit over that time period would be $127 trillion. Our debt at that point, based on those projections, by the way, would be, I've got it, about $128 trillion divided by $64.8 trillion economy would be 197% debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP. Those are real scary numbers. Let me put this further into context, then I'll be done. To put that number into context, because I realize trillions of dollars are just incomprehensible, currently the net private asset base of America, all assets held by businesses large and small and households, is about $96 trillion. So in the next 30 years, which, by the way, my little baby is now 30 years old, and that went by like that. So the relevant time frame, the baby boom generation retiring, all these benefits we promised and we have not made adequate provisions to pay for it, that long-term fiscal challenge that the Madam Chair talked about us addressing. The only way we're going to address that is we admit we've got the problem, we start properly defining it, and put it in the terms that American people understand. Percentage GDP is not a term or a way of presenting this the American people understand. I think they'll start getting that. And if we start talking in these terms about the real danger facing this nation, we just might have an opportunity to, in a bipartisan fashion, get everything on the table and start working toward real solutions so we stop mortgaging our children's future. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Sessions. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here. A lot of the terrain that I intended to cover has already been covered by my colleagues, but I thought I'd still like to visit it with perhaps a Wisconsin face. Starting with the report on the impact of the Affordable Care Act on people choosing to leave the workforce, to me this brings me directly to a bunch of very hardworking people who I've been proud to represent both in the House and the Senate for many years, and I think of family dairy farms. For so many years, one of the family has usually had to leave the farm to work solely to bring in health insurance. Whether it's because of the pre-ACA rules whereby insurance companies could deny coverage to people with pre-existing health conditions, or simply the risks and actuarial risks associated with covering a small organization in a risky business. And that story has repeated itself. You know, I've met so many folks that are in that situation, and I think about the fact that they may, now that they can get family health coverage in a marketplace, choose to leave those jobs. and that will be counted in one way, but I can assure you when they return full-time to the farm, that they will be working, both investing their efforts and labor in raising their families, caring for senior relatives, but also engaged in the economic activity of the farm. And I appreciated your blog entry the other day trying to bring greater clarity to what sort of movement in and out of the workplace this is, that you know, when somebody's laid off, we mourn and we are upset, but when somebody chooses to leave in this sort of manner, whether it's retiring or doing what they really want to be doing, work in their family enterprise, that's more of a reason for celebration. I also note in the report on the slow recovery of the labor market, some of the recent numbers on the number of job seekers per job opening that exist. Of course, we reached a huge peak in, I guess, 2009 of 6.7 job seekers per open job, and then dropped to what is now, I guess, 2.7, somewhere I've been hearing between 2.7 and 2.9 in the fall of last year. And so I know it's not a part of your affordable care analysis to talk about what happens when people do leave the job market or leave jobs because they can secure health insurance. But is it reasonable or logical to assume that there will be 2.7 people today looking to seize that opportunity if that dislocation occurs?
Yes, Senator, the effects of changes in the supply of labor are very different under the economic conditions we face in the country today, where there is, as you noted, a large excess of people looking for jobs who can't find them, than the effects that reduction in labor supply will have later in this decade when we think that the job market will have tightened considerably. Under current economic conditions, where it really is the demand for labor that's limiting the level of employment, changes in the number of workers doesn't have much effect on the actual ultimate level of employment. However, by later in the decade, I think that's the point you're referring to, but I want to emphasize that by later in the decade, when the job market will have tightened, that's a point at which we think changes in labor supply really will translate into changes in the number of people who are employed, because we think that this 2.7 number will come back down to the more standard level we have in the labor force, just given the normal turnover.
Yeah. And I know that my time is running out, so I just briefly want to associate myself with some of the previous comments on our ongoing debate on extending emergency unemployment benefits, long-term unemployment benefits. When you were last before the committee, we actually engaged in a conversation based on the Federal Reserve paper on the long-term unemployed and how they've become less attached to the workforce and have lost skills they once held and present other real challenges. I just have to say, when this emergency unemployment compensation lapsed at the end of December, the statistics in Wisconsin are about 23,700 Wisconsinites lost benefits. It's supposed to, if let continue throughout the year, hit somewhere close to 99,000. And we know the statistics nationally. The stories are heartbreaking. Foreclosure, I hear from folks on the number of jobs they've applied for, the budgets that they've been trying to live on with unemployment assistance and what that will mean to not have it. I guess I just would ask, is it correct to state that extending unemployment insurance is one of the most cost-effective ways to stimulate a weak economy?
Yes, that's right, Senator. A report that we did a couple of years ago about a number of alternative possibilities that you and your colleagues could pursue to strengthen the economy and add jobs in the short run. Expansion of unemployment insurance benefits was the most cost-effective item on that list.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Ayotte.
I want to thank the chair and the ranking member, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. Appreciate your being here today. I wanted to ask you, yesterday the administration announced another delay in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act for the business community. Businesses with 50 to 99 employees were given an additional year to comply with the law, and businesses with 100 more employees are now able to phase in their compliance with the law. Is this something you have looked at, and has the CBO had an opportunity to review this most recent change and budgetary impact? And do you think it will have a difference? I mean, in your report, you basically, I think, put off some of the conclusions based on the original date of the employer mandate going in 2015 in terms of what the impact will be on, for example, part-time employment, other employment issues. Where do we stand with all of these changes made essentially unilaterally by executive order to this law in terms of CBO's analysis on the overall impact on the workforce?
So the analysis in this report that we released, the reports we released last week, both in terms of the budgetary effects and the economic effects of the Affordable Care Act, are based on our view of how the Affordable Care Act would unfold as of early December. So these analyses we do are very complicated, and we need to stop taking on board changes in what's happening and focus on the analysis in order to get these reports done. We are already at work on our next baseline projections. Every year, as you know, we do projections in the spring that are the basis for our cost estimates for the rest of the year. And so we're already working to update our projections for the Affordable Care Act and other aspects of the budget. Yesterday's announcement was, of course, as much a surprise to us as you. These things are complicated, so people have started to look at it, but we have reached no conclusions yet. But our spring baseline projections will incorporate the effects of all of the changes in policy that we can get in, as well as all that we learn about what's happening in the insurance exchanges and in Medicaid programs in different states and so on. That's why we labeled these updates that we released last week as quote, both partial and preliminary.
Well, at the rate the administration is changing this law unilaterally, I think your people are going to have to be working overtime because it seems like it's a moving target. So I think this could be a real challenge for you.
I assure you, Senator, the people who work in healthcare are working overtime.
I bet they are. I can only imagine. I wanted to ask you about the issue that Senator Toomey asked you in the conclusion in the report about the reduction essentially in the labor participation rate that you've predicted as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Are you concerned at all when you look at this reduction in the labor force in terms of the impact on the subsidies that will cause some people to either leave the workforce or work less hours, as I understand your report? Did I understand it correctly?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Who will that have a more disproportionate effect on, lower wage workers or higher wage workers?
The change in labor supply will be primarily by lower wage workers because they are the people who are facing the largest change in incentives under the Affordable Care Act.
So are you worried at all that the incentives could have a discouragement also on upward mobility? Because if there's a relationship between the amount of subsidy that you receive and whether or not you will continue working or perhaps seek higher employment, could that become a discouragement to upward mobility? In other words, do I take that promotion or don't I for lower wage workers? And we want to encourage more upward mobility.
Yes, Senator, I think the provisions of the Affordable Care Act that we studied reduce the incentive to provide more labor, and that can be reducing the incentive to work more hours or reducing the incentive to work harder in those hours or to do other things that would advance one's labor earnings.
So is it fair to say one of the concerns we should be keeping an eye on here is that the structure of the law could reduce some incentives for upward mobility? In other words, people seeking to go sort of up higher in the workforce, depending on how based on the structures of the subsidies. That's what I'm trying to understand.
So I think, Senator, that the particular provisions that I've talked about would, as you're suggesting, reduce upward mobility in that way. But I want to be very careful not to make that conclusion for the Affordable Care Act as a whole, because we've not done that particular analysis. And the provision of subsidized health insurance to lower-income people may also affect their upward mobility, and we simply haven't analyzed that. So I think these particular provisions that we're talking about that reduce the amount of labor supply do reduce the incentive for people to move up the earnings ladder. But I don't want to suggest that we've drawn that conclusion for the Affordable Care Act as a whole, because other aspects of the provisions could have different effects, and we haven't studied.
No, and I understand, and I wouldn't ask you to draw it as a whole because we don't really know yet with the changing landscape, with the executive orders, exactly when things will be implemented on the whole, so I can understand why you'd want to qualify your answer. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator King.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. First, I'd like to say you're the indispensable man around here. I admire you, and I admire you even more today watching you. You remind me of the guy walking on the tightrope across the Grand Canyon between the various questions, and I think you're doing it very well, and you're providing a tremendous service to us. One technical question, then some more larger ones. What's the lag time in terms of the increase in interest rates and effects on interest charges? In other words, if all of our debt today was locked in at 10 years at 2%, an interest rate change next year would have no effect, as I see it. And I'm just trying to understand what components of the debt are locked in and what are short-term, because I'm concerned about this interest rate increase and the impact on the budget and the crowding out of other priorities. But there's a time lag thing here, isn't there?
Yes, there is, Senator. In our estimates of the effect on the budget of having interest rates that are 1 percentage point higher throughout the coming decade, we take explicit account of the phenomenon you're describing, which is that the government will sell some new debt next year, and that will incur the higher interest rates right away. Other debt will not roll over for 8, 9, 10 years, and some debt won't mature at all within the 10-year budget window.
So it wouldn't be accurate to take $17 trillion and say if interest rates go up next week 1%, then you 1% of $17 trillion. That's not the way
that doesn't work. What we publish in this appendix to the Outlook is itself a rule of thumb for you and your colleagues to use, but our rule of thumb takes account of the phenomenon you're describing.
Thank you. And I perhaps want to follow up on that to get the data.
We're happy to talk to you, Senator.
All this talk about the effect of the Affordable Care Act on people's employment decisions, I believe that in the long run, probably the most lasting and important effect of the Affordable Care Act will be the very subject we've talked about, which is the virtual elimination or certainly the significant reduction of job lock, because it's going to free people to start new businesses. That's where the dynamism comes in the country. And I know people, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows people who said, I've got a great idea, but I can't leave my job because I've got a sick child and I can't lose my insurance. So, you know, this idea that somehow we're discouraging people from work, we're actually liberating people to follow the American principle of self-determination and creativity and innovation. And I think that's a hidden benefit, frankly, of the Affordable Care Act that I'm not sure people really calculate. I realize that's hard to calculate in economic terms. But I believe that is going to be very significant. And the idea that somehow if the Affordable Care Act, by taking away the linkage between employment and health insurance is something we should discourage. We want everyone to work. You know, pensions, Social Security, why not have everybody work till they're 100? I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. We want people working because they need to, they want to provide for their families, and they want to be creative about it. A specific question to get to my another question is, are tax expenditures just like Head Start or Pell Grants?
As you know, Senator, they're recorded in different ways in the budget, but there is a widespread consensus among analysts that tax expenditures have very similar sorts of effects to direct federal spending, and thus should be viewed similarly to direct federal spending by both analysts and policymakers.
And I would commend to my colleagues from page 89 on in the report a very good analysis of tax expenditures. And really, you say they're almost like entitlements, because if you are legally qualified, you get them, and they aren't examined very often, and they just go on forever. Correct?
Yes, that's right, Senator.
It just strikes me that we're talking around here about how we pay for things, and it's okay to pay for it by taking away some benefit that the disabled get or somebody else, but to say you can't look at tax expenditures because that's revenues is really a misunderstanding of the fact that the two are really virtually identical.
I want to mention, Senator, we issued a report last year that looked more in-depth way at tax expenditures, including at the distribution of tax expenditures and also at their economic effects. And people who are interested in that topic are happy to send you that report.
I haven't seen that report, but I'm guessing that tax expenditures tend to go more heavily to people with higher incomes?
Well, the different expenditures are quite different. So the earned income tax credit induces some tax expenditures that are obviously toward the lower end of the income distribution, but the state and local income tax deduction tends to be more toward the high end of the distribution. So we will make sure you have that on your desk today, Senator.
Fine. I'll have one more question for the record, but a final question is, not fixing infrastructure is debt, is it not?
Well, it's a different sort of future commitment.
But it has to be paid eventually.
We think we will ultimately repair the bridge or expand the highway. Then not doing it now, putting it off, is putting a burden on the future in a way that is similar to the burden of doing something and borrowing to pay for it.
Carefully parsed, but I would take your answer as a yes.
Senator, I would like to close by noting that although you kindly refer to me as indispensable, as you and your colleagues understand, it is my colleagues who are indispensable. And if I have good answers for your questions, it's because of the things they have taught me. But they also taught me to be careful in how I put things.
And I'll bet after last week you certainly understand that. Thank you, sir.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your indispensable staff and you and your personal responsiveness to our questions and your input, and for being here today. I've got so much I want to ask you about and so little time, so I'm going to go quickly here. I want to focus on three things. One, of course, is what the real problem is in the deficit, and I think your new report only emphasizes what we already knew. Second is what can we do on growth, and then third is what is the impact of Obamacare on growth. In terms of the deficits, this was a discouraging report for me because it shows things are getting even worse. If you could give me just a series of quick yes or no answers, that'd be great. Am I correct that in the past 50 years, federal revenues have averaged just under 18% of GDP?
Senator, we report averages for 40 years, and we say it's been about 17.5%.
Okay, yet less than 18% over the last 40 years. Over the next decade, you're projected that it will average more than 18% of GDP. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're saying it'll keep rising thereafter?
Under current law, yes.
Okay. So the notion earlier we talked about, that we need more revenue. We're above the historic average based on your projections over the next 10 years and continuing to grow. How about discretionary spending, what we call other mandatory spending? Are those falling as a percent of the economy over the long term?
Yes, under current law, Senator, and the projection rules.
So what's left? Discretionary spending is what we appropriate here every year. Other mandatory is part of the two-thirds of the budget is mandatory. Social Security, health entitlements, 7.8% of GDP in 2005, now 9.7% of GDP, on their way to 13.7% of GDP in the next 20 years. Is that correct?
That sounds right, Senator.
And you project that health entitlements alone are going to go up over 100%, more than double, 115% in the next 10 years now. Is that right?
The spending for the major health care programs we project to rise from 4.8% of GDP this year to 6.1% in 2024.
In nominal terms?
You're referring to a nominal...
In nominal terms, you go 115% over the next 10 years.
I take your word for it, Senator.
Okay. Steeply rising national debt and its resulting interest costs are mostly the result of what? Borrowing for what specific programs?
Well, the borrowing is for the gap between spending and revenues,
right,
Senator. But the part of the budget which is
we just talked about the fact that
growing most substantially is spending for Social Security and the major health care programs.
Okay. So we have identified what the focus ought to be. We're heading toward record high tax revenues over the decade, nearly record low discretionary spending, falling other mandatory spending. So we're talking about these important programs, but unsustainable in their current form, health care entitlements, Social Security, and the resulting net interest costs. Is that correct?
There's a striking shift in the composition of government spending toward those few large programs you've highlighted, Senator, yes, and away from other things.
So the next question is, how do you solve that? Obviously, we need reforms. Again, incredibly important programs, but we've heard a lot about a balanced solution, which basically is to make the next generation pay the cost for our generation, as opposed to reforming these programs. So that is very clear in your report. This is the problem. We've got to address it, and if we don't, we will face consequences you talked about earlier, including the possibility of a fiscal crisis. Second, the economy. I found it depressing, actually. what you put out in your report. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that you're asking us to accept a new normal. And that new normal is not 4 or 5% growth, it's 2% growth. In fact, what you tell us is that in this new baseline, you pared back your economic growth assumptions, which, by the way, have always been more optimistic than what actually happened in the last several years, and so I understand why you did it. 2.5% over the next decade, decelerating to just 2% in 2024. $1.4 trillion less tax revenue, therefore, over the next decade. And, this is not the first time this has happened. Since, again, President Obama took office, you have consistently come out with decreases in projected economic growth. Those have translated just in this president's term to more than $2.2 trillion in reduced tax revenue when you take those projections out to 2024. So, and remember, this is all about the bad economy since the president took office. So earlier you talked about this, but economic growth obviously is key. Restraining the spending, reforming this growth, we need it. Economic growth through tax reform, would that make sense, lowering the rate and broadening the base?
That would be good for the economy, Senator.
How about trade?
Amount depends on the specifics of the reform.
Yeah. Would trade be good for the economy, expanding trade?
Yes, it probably would be, Senator. Again,
okay. Trade promotion authority is before us right now. How about long-term debt reduction through these reforms we've talked about?
That would be good for the economy.
That would be good for the economy. So there's three things.
Senator.
How about more domestic energy production?
I think that would be good for the economy as well.
This is what's frustrating is we've got these things that you know would work and we know would work, and if we would just do them, we could both deal with the spending side and the growth side. On Obamacare, just quickly, I appreciate you've looked at the work of Casey Mulligan and others, University of Chicago. There's been a lot of talk about this today. People are leaving the workforce because of this sharp cliff. I would say to my colleagues on the side who said, this is all about moms who want to stay home with their kids, and it's all about people starting new businesses or even working in their family businesses. I mean, if you're working, then you're not out of the workforce first. But tell us the demographics of this group that's likely to drop out. What do you know about them?
The attributes of the group?
Yeah.
So the biggest effects, as we wrote, Senator, are primarily on people of lower income because they are the ones who are receiving the subsidies through the Affordable Care Act. And it's the existence of the subsidies and the withdrawal as people's income rises that reduces the incentive to work.
So as Mulligan says, about a 50% in effect tax or penalty on work because of this cliff. But tell us who these folks are. Do you think it is primarily people who are liking to retire early or moms who want to stay home with their kids? Who is it? And I ask you this because when you look at the labor participation rate, which is already at 1970s levels, it's a record low for men right now. It's a record low for working men. And here we are taking this labor participation rate even lower, fewer people working, which is bad for the economy, it's bad for growth, it's bad for prosperity. When you look at this data that we know out there, and the early indications are this tends to be single men, they tend to be childless. And my concern is we're going to even exacerbate further this already record level. What do you think about that?
So, Senator, the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act affect a broad range of types of people, and we did not do this analysis in a way that lets us isolate the effects on particular
people. Could you look at the Brookings study on that and look at whatever else you think is appropriate and get back to me on that as to who you think really is going to be affected here? We talked about the fact that these are people who you want to get on that ladder of opportunity, that income ladder, and moving up on the ladder. And this takes them off the ladder, reduces their Social Security benefits, as you know, because their lifetime earnings are going to be reduced. It takes them out of this possibility of being able to achieve their dream for themselves and their families because they lose, again, the dignity and self-respect and the opportunity that comes with work. And that's my concern, is that I know I disagree on some of the Obamacare impacts on the labor demand side. I think that $1 trillion in new taxes does have an effect on workers. I think also the 50-person limit and the part-time at 30 hours does have an effect. We may disagree on some of that. But this data is really concerning because it exacerbates an already terrible problem we have. And you don't have to do it. You can solve these health care problems without that stiff cliff. And that's one of the differences maybe between the two sides here, is that there are ways to do it, including through the tax code, that have been talked about where you wouldn't have that 50% penalty and still be able to address many of the problems on pre-existing conditions and other issues that have been raised today. I'm over my time. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Murray, and thank you, Director Elmendorf, for your work and for the work of your team and for the very valuable report you've delivered. I'm struck at how, across all the questions from members of this committee, the one North Star is economic growth. We have talked back and forth about this Grand Canyon that Senator King suggested you are trying to navigate across the tightrope. The other side wants to focus almost exclusively on entitlement reform. We want to talk about tax expenditures. We think extending unemployment insurance will be stimulated for the economy. They think reducing regulatory burden we seem to go back and forth on these issues with great predictability. One thing that I wanted to ask for your input on was the one area where I hear general agreement between our parties, and that's in manufacturing. Restoring robust economic growth in the United States strikes me as one of the best ways to achieve deficit reduction and to achieve return to full employment and to achieve a lot of other shared objectives. There are about 25 of my colleagues and more than a dozen bipartisan bills that would strengthen significantly the environment, the ground for manufacturing and for the continuing growth in manufacturing employment in the United States. Manufacturing jobs, as you know, are among the highest quality jobs. They have the best multiplier effect, and they have the best impact on their immediate community. And the bills broadly speak to skills, access to credit, investment in R&D, export markets, infrastructure. Could you just comment on the relative importance of manufacturing as a sector to contributing to growth and what you see as appropriate policy actions we might take on a bipartisan basis that would strengthen that sector?
Senator, those are hard questions which I don't have adequate answers. You're certainly correct that manufacturing jobs have tended in the past to provide higher than average wages and better than average benefits. But we have not done an analysis ourselves, at least in my time at CBO, or that I'm aware of what policy actions might do for the manufacturing sector and how that might then ripple through the broader economy. So again, you ask questions to which I wish I had answers, but I don't have them, I'm afraid.
Well, I'd be eager to work with you if I possibly could at submitting for some review and discussion a variety of both historical and prospective policy tools that have been brought to me and to many of my colleagues by the manufacturing sector, by manufacturing leaders in my state and country around skills, credit, export, R&D. It is an area where government action and fiscal policy can make a significant enduring difference. Let me turn to one other topic in my time here, which is interest rates, and a number of other senators have asked about this. There are, I think, roughly half of our current debt held by foreigners, and they have difficulty, I think, sometimes discerning the dance of politics here in the Capitol. I'd be interested in what you view as the short-term and long-term threats to our interest rate, to our debt service costs. We have in recent years had, in my view, far too many close calls where there was open discussion of the possibility of default, and I think that has increased our borrowing costs. And then there are long-term drivers that also create some question about the debt service costs that we may face going forward. So if you just briefly speak to the short-term and long-term drivers, I'd be grateful.
So, Senator, we think that defaulting on any obligation of the U.S. government would be a dangerous gamble. And that is importantly because until now investors have been able to count on the federal government paying its debt. And if that were to change, it would have consequences that could be very severe, but that are hard to quantify given the lack of historical experience. Interest rates can go up or down for a variety of reasons, and some would be good things for the economy as a whole, but would make the government's interest burden larger, and some, for example, if there were much stronger economic growth than we expect over the next few years, that could increase private credit demands and push up interest rates in a way that would basically make this committee and other people happy about the economy, but could raise the cost of government borrowing. If the economy is weaker in the next several years than we expect, that could keep interest rates lower. So there are economic factors that will matter, but also the perceived risk of Treasury securities and the perceived risk of other investments. As you know, capital can come into the U.S. Treasury market if it is leaving other financial markets that seem more dangerous. There's a wide panoply of factors that can affect interest rates. But although one might root for low interest rates for the federal government, of course, that might come together with a weak economy, which is exactly what you are not rooting for. So one doesn't want to think about high or low interest rates as necessarily correlating with good or bad economic circumstances in general. And we look at a variety of forces that can affect interest rates in our projections. We think we balance the risks, but the risk of rates being a good deal higher or lower than we thought is a very real one.
But to be clear, if I understood your testimony, publicly discussing the possibility of default, urging default as a negotiating tool in policy debates is, and I think I'm quoting you, a dangerous gamble.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our colleagues who participated today. Dr. Elmendorf, I especially want to thank you. And again, this committee really does appreciate all the hard work that you and all of your staff put in order for us to do our work. So thank you very much for being here. As a reminder to all of our colleagues, if you have any additional statements or questions, they need to be submitted by 6 p.m. today.
Madam Chair, just briefly, it looks like the President's budget will be late again. There are some reasons for that. Director Burwell called to discuss that.
She's been very clear that we were late, they're late.
But that result is causing us a problem I'll write you about. Fundamentally, by the time she testifies, we still will not have had the complete budget. I think that would be better. So in some way we could alter the course we are on so that we do have the President's complete budget when she testifies. I think that would be essential for our
happy to discuss it with you.
Smooth operation. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So